The promise of summer is always hard to live up to. It's a time when I vow to savour what is denied me in the rushing year, to squeeze the nectar from its long daylight, drink in its deeper colour. And yet the stronger that promise, the more swiftly evening comes, sunlight spent, summer's cup drained to the dregs. So it's the 3rd of July today, and I've come out to Las Bielański. It's one of my favourite little forests in Warsaw. There are quite a number of them, but this one is particularly pretty, I think. And it's the beginning of my summer break, so I thought it would be a nice time to begin another reading diary and share what I find myself reading with you. So I've never had the fortune to visit Japan, but as long as I can remember, I've been interested in Japanese things, fascinated by Japanese culture. It probably started when I was very young, and a sort of taste-making uncle brought my brother and me various VHS tapes of anime films. Very likely far too young, we watched and re-watched, among many others, things like the cyberpunk body horror classic Akira, the epic demonic fantasy Devilman, and the oversexed gender-bending story of alien invasion, Project Echo. I think that absorbing those sort of psychedelic, dystopian, cyberpunk dreamscapes had a huge influence on my imagination as a child. And my sense of beauty was certainly nourished by Studio Ghibli films, Laputa, as I knew it then, and what was then titled Warriors of the Wind were special favourites. I recall that we had a VHS copy of My Neighbour Totoro that was entirely in Japanese. There were no English subtitles. But even though we couldn't follow the story beat by beat, it didn't stop us being sort of mesmerised by its distinctive vision. Growing up, I also played a lot of computer games, many of which had a very pointed Japanese flavour. And in 1999, Christmas 1999, I fell utterly in love with Yu Suzuki's, for the time, outrageously ambitious game Shenmue, which gives the player a window into small-town life in Japan in the 1980s. What intrigued me most about it was not the dramatic revenge narrative or the mastery of martial arts, but the quieter moments spent wandering around Dobuita, visiting arcades, watching the weather change and the lights come on at evening time, and simply being able to soak up this simulacrum of Japanese life.
Ah, good.
As I grew up and became more interested in literature, I suppose at a certain point it must have dawned on me that Japan also had its own literary culture, and that's something I could explore in translation, obviously. And one of the first writers I encountered, of course, was Yukio Mishima. And I still recall being utterly captivated by his sort of acute psychological portraits of his characters, the way in which he could draw with such intensity this sort of seething inner turmoil that constantly threatens to erupt and shatter this sort of pristine, serene surface. And that's something that's echoed in his prose, this great violence and brutality or intensity of emotion, combined with a sort of supreme elegance of style. This is true of many of his books, but the one that spoke to me most as a young person was The Temple of the Golden Pavilion from 1956, where this struggle finds outward manifestation in the destructive act at the book's climax. I also feel as though I found Mishima's books at the right time. That there's something that really speaks to the teenage mind, I think, who a teenager is obviously experiencing unprecedented intensity of emotion, and at the same time trying to cobble together some kind of outward sense of normality. Of course, I later discovered lots of other Japanese writers, many of whom I came to admire enormously, among them Kenzaburo Oe, Edogawa Rampo, Natsume Sozaki, Ryonosuke Akutagawa, Osamu Dazai, and so on. It occurred to me recently that so many of these Japanese writers that I've read and whom I admire, pretty much exclusively, they're all men, and that I've hardly read any women writers at all from Japan. And so I thought it would be a nice idea to try and correct that a little bit. So I'm going to spend a portion of my summer and this reading diary getting to grips with some Japanese women writers. So the first book that I'm reading for this diary is In the Shade of Spring Leaves, which is the life of Higuchi Ichio and a collection of her stories. It's written and translated by the American scholar of Japanese, Robert Lyons Danley. And I'm about halfway through at the moment, or just over halfway through. So I've read the biographical part of it, and I was completely enthralled by it, by this extraordinary woman who, over the course of a very brief life and a sort of active literary career of only 4 years, from 1892 to 1896, left such an impact on Japanese letters. Ichio Higuchi, or Higuchi Ichio, to use the Japanese order, was the second daughter in a samurai family. From an early age, she was clearly a gifted child. Her father, Noriyoshi Higuchi, took great interest in her education. Danley writes that the father hoped she would continue in the scholarly tradition of her grandfather, a tradition that he himself had relinquished for worldly success. The family had periods of comfort and prosperity, but these would not last forever. It was a painful irony of Noriyoshi Higuchi's life that he had worked tirelessly throughout it to purchase his samurai rank, only for the rank itself to be dissolved the very next year with the Meiji Restoration of 1868. A series of misfortunes and poorly planned business ventures meant that after his early death, Noriyoshi's wife and 2 daughters were left nearly destitute, forced to scrape together a living by relying on neighbours and friends, and trying to recover old debts from Noriyoshi's time lending money. It's quite extraordinary that Ichio managed to secure an enduring literary reputation under such circumstances. Though she lived only to be 24 years old, Danley's biography demonstrates well just how much of an impact she left upon Japanese literature and how much she contributed to the development of Japanese prose, which, during the frenetic transformation of the Meiji period in which she lived, was under great pressure to adapt, to forge itself anew, both in response to the influence of European writing to which the country had begun to open up, and in its response to a need to retain the essence of a national cultural consciousness. This is one of the truly wonderful things about the book. And not only does the biography sort of paint a wonderful portrait of this extraordinary woman, of her achievements and her education, her psychological state, and so on, and her struggles, particularly with poverty. And we have access to these thanks to a diary that she kept quite rigorously throughout her life, and fragments of it are translated throughout the biographical portion of the book. But Danley also manages to draw a really informed sort of overview of the literary culture of the period and the sort of factors that were informing her work, and gives a strong sense of how she forged her own voice within that. Danley ties together the various competing threads, the reverence for classical Japanese literature of the Heian period, which is the model that Ichio was trained in during her formative years. That is, in highly codified and formally strict modes of composition, which by the late 19th century had come to seem distinctly mannered and stuffy. There's also the popular literature of the day, a dying legacy of the Gesaku genre, playful stories of romance and adventure, a style that Ichio found too frivolous for her own ambitions, and also a new brand of psychological realism in the European mode, such as that introduced by writers like Mori Ogai, who had spent time in Europe, knew several European languages, and imported the latest literary experiments into Japanese prose. This is the landscape in which this young woman from an impoverished samurai family had to find her place. The first 3 stories in the collection, Flowers at Dusk, A Snowy Day, and The Sound of the Koto, are very much mood pieces. What narrative there is rather lightly sketched, and instead the emphasis seems to be on imagery and atmosphere and mood, which is something that appeals to me enormously. There's also a sort of tapestry of illusion woven through all of the stories that I've read so far, and I suspect that that's going to be part of Ichio's style. But what's amazing is that in this edition, Robert Lyons Danley has provided copious footnotes to identify all of these allusions and provide the relevant context that really helps me engage with it. And most of the allusions are to the Heian period, things like Genji Monogatari and the Pillow Book, but also lots of classical tanka. Incidentally, just as an aside, I absolutely adore footnotes. So I'm always a huge fan of scholarly editions, and this one really is particularly helpful for someone who doesn't have a background or an enormous amount of knowledge of Heian period literature or classical Japanese writing, Japanese poetry, and so on. And especially when this kind of illusion is such an integral part of a writer's style, it's immeasurably helpful, I'd say. The resulting impression of these early pieces, which Danley seems to think of as juvenilia, is of a writer working within quite strictly prescribed conventions. The codes embedded within the allusions here seem to be a huge contributing factor to the emotional import of the texts. To give a few examples, the tolling of the bell at the end of the opening story signals not only the death of the protagonist for the love of her sweetheart, but also draws on an image from Heike Monogatari, which famously opens with a reference to the temple bell at Gion. The bell at Gion Temple tolls the evanescence of all things. The faded flowers of the teak tree beside the deathbed of the Buddha bear witness to his teaching that those who flourish will one day also decay. Other images, such as the crying of the deer in autumn, hold the same cumulative resonance and pathos as a result of conventional use over many centuries. Danley describes this technique as something known as Honkadori, the convention of alluding to the phrasing or to the imagery of an older poem and then transforming it subtly. And I really love this. It's something that appeals to me very much as well. The idea that you're placing your own work in a kind of a continuum of tradition, and also that you're sort of actively working towards the evolution of that tradition. I think it's quite beautiful. It's hardly surprising that Ichio's style would be so elusive, so tied to tradition. Her education at the Haginoya school, an institution steeped in the tradition of court poetry, introduced her to the classics of Japanese literature and instructed her in the formal composition of poems in the classical style. She took part in poetry competitions, was led by her teachers on outings to view the cherry and plum blossoms. Danley writes that the Haginoya so emulated the gossamer world of Heian romances, where breeding and literary sense were all synonymous, that Ichio soon imagined herself living in some latter-day court. My favourite piece in the collection so far has to be the fourth story, Encounters on a Dark Night, which, although it's far more narrative focused than any of the others have been so far, it doesn't compromise at all on its atmosphere and mood, or on that tapestry of illusion that I was speaking of earlier. It tells the story of a ruined estate, a sort of crumbling manor whose gate is boarded up and whose roofs are choked with weeds. And outside of this crumbling estate, a young boy is run over by a rickshaw driver, and the ethereal beauty, somewhat ghostly beauty, who dwells within the walls of the estate, nurses him back to health, and he becomes sort of embroiled in her revenge narrative. It feels wonderfully Gothic. It feels a lot like something like the fall of the House of Usher, this sense of faded grandeur that you get in the best Edgar Allan Poe stories. And I wasn't expecting to find something with that kind of energy to it. But I am a huge fan of Japanese horror, or Japanese ghost stories, the kind that Lafcadio Hearn recorded, or that you see in the film Kwaidan, which is based on his stories. Curiously, one of the tales in Kwaidan's masterful painted world, Hoichi the Earless, features a balladeer reciting portions of the tale of the Heike to the accompaniment of the biwa. It's a wonderfully haunting piece of cinema. There's a bookshop here in Warsaw that focuses on East Asian literature, and since I'm reading Japanese writers at the moment, I thought it would be nice to go and have a look and see what they've got. Tajfuny, as a publisher, puts out many translations into Polish of Asian literature, particularly East Asian literature. Their very pretty bookshop on Chmielna in central Warsaw is small but beautifully curated, and also carries quite a number of English translations of Asian literature, as well as books on related subjects. So I thought I'd just let you know what I picked up at Tajfuny. I was really excited to find this David Peace book, Patient X, the casebook of Ryonosuke Akutagawa. It seems to be an interesting experiment in biography and fiction, a kind of blending of the two. And David Peace is someone that I've been wanting to read for quite a while. He's better known, I suppose, for the Red Riding Quartet, but I think for most of the latter stage of his career he's been based in Japan and has written on Japanese subjects. So this seemed wonderfully pertinent as a find today. And I also picked up Apple and Knife by Intan Paramaditha. This is an Indonesian writer. These are horror short stories, and I've been meaning to track them down for quite a while as well. I also have another book by her called The Wandering, which seems really interesting structurally. It's sort of a choose-your-own-adventure text, but reimagined as a kind of literary novel. So yeah, very excited to read these as well. So it's the 9th of July today. It's absolutely sweltering here in Warsaw. It's a really hot day. I've come out to Ogród Krasińskich, a little local park, which is quite pretty, I think. I've now finished In the Shade of Spring Leaves, the Higuchi Ichio book. I thought it would be nice to have a little chat with you about it here. So there were certainly some surprises involved in reading this collection. While those first 3 or 4 stories are written in this kind of classical Heian period inspired style that feels quite kind of impressionistic and deeply elusive, as her career progresses, she seems to become far more interested in social issues, particularly in things like poverty and inequality and the plight of women. And her style shifts to a sort of urban realism, and she's very effective at writing that story. It's particularly noticeable in quite a powerful story called On the Last Day of the Year, which involves a maid who is forced to ask her quite brutal and parsimonious employer for a loan in order to save her sick uncle from falling even further into debt. On the Last Day of the Year is a story about money and labour. It offers a bleak vision of a yawning class divide, and is clearly written with an indignant finger pointed upward at those who live out their lives in blithe ignorance of the suffering endured by the class that tends to their everyday needs. And having read Dan Lee's biography, I find it difficult to imagine that Ichio wasn't deeply informed by her own financially strained circumstances. In 1893, just a year before that story was published, she was forced to move with her sister and her mother from the aristocratic hills to the lowlands on the outskirts of the city. Or as Danley puts it, the Higuchi women gave up any pretense of belonging to the gentle class. The Higuchi women were forced to sell most of their possessions, including Ichio's father's beloved antique scrolls of landscapes and calligraphy. Danley describes how they loaded their paltry belongings into a cart, disappearing to the edges of the city to open a cheap store selling paper goods. The venture, in an unfortunate echo of Noriyoshi's career in business, was ultimately a failure. The women lacked the adequate funds to stock the shop properly. Often its shelves were bare. These hardships begin to seep into Ichio's stories as her career continues. You also notice a distinctly feminist strain emerging in some of these later stories. It's very apparent, for instance, in a famous story, The 13th Night, or at least it's a story that's been written about a lot, which deals with a young woman who's married well. She's married above her station. Her husband has an imperial appointment, and for her own parents, who are slightly lower on the social hierarchy, this is an enormous source of pride and a kind of release of a certain financial burden on them. But Ichigo is very careful to kind of outline the emotional costs of this match. The story involves the young woman Oseki running away to her parents' house and confessing that in her own home she occupies little more than the status of servant and wet nurse, and is constantly forced to endure her husband's abuse. The torrent of belittlement, disregard and violence forces Oseki away to her parents, where she pours out a flood of complaints. The reason he doesn't spend more time at home, he says, is because I do everything so badly. I can't even seem to hold my chopsticks to suit him. All he ever says is how boring I am, how worthless. Then he calls me a slug and says how can he care for anyone with so little spirit or self-respect? He's a monster, not a husband. I found this feminist strain in Ichigo's work particularly interesting, especially given that Meiji-era literary circles certainly appear to be very much dominated by men, and that there were even quite patently sexist responses to her work. There's a book by Rebecca Copeland called Lost Leaves, which aims largely to kind of dispel the myth that Ichigo is the only female writer of the Meiji era. It focuses on several other writers from the same period. She lists a few of these responses that can appear quite offensive, I think. One critic writes, "Conceal the author's name, and a reader would probably never guess it was written by a woman." Another says, "She has as much talent as any man." And Copeland goes on to say that the only way a woman can earn recognition as a significant writer, therefore, is to transcend her sex. Higuchi Ichigo must be transformed into an honorary man before she can be accepted for serious study. If these are the prevailing attitudes of the period, then it makes it just that much more fascinating, I think, that in Ichigo's final stories, she would turn her attention to the pleasure quarter, to the courtesans of the Yoshiwara. I know that, for instance, later writers like Nagai Kafu wrote extensively about life in the pleasure districts, but I can't help but wonder what it must mean for a young woman of the Meiji period to take up her brush and write about this as her subject. The new home of the Higuchi women in Ryosenji was a mere stone's throw from the Yoshiwara. Ichigo's diary records some anxieties and disappointments about the new area, the regular clatter of passing rickshaws at 3 a.m, the reputation of the locals for barbarous behaviour, her fear of rough treatment, especially as 3 women without a man in the house. She laments, "We have fallen in the world and drifted here to rot in these stagnant waters." It's also clear, however, that she finds a certain romance and fascination in the new environment. In another diary entry, she records a description of a lady minstrel, which illustrates this well. "Every night there is a lady minstrel who plays songs of love-suicide on her samisen. She wears a scallop-patterned summer kimono of pale yellow and a sash of black satin. She ties a scarf around her hair, Yoshiwara style. I wonder what she used to be. A geisha, it would seem. A heartbreaker, no doubt. She must have made the thrushes cry, as the saying goes." And it's in the Yoshiwara that Ichigo sets what I think is really the standout piece of writing in this collection. It's an extraordinary story called Child's Play, and what makes it stand out from the others, I think, is a kind of new panoramic and polyphonic kind of quality that isn't really observable in any of the other stories. It has a kind of chaotic linguistic density, and it really manages to place the reader in this environment where urban modernity and ancient customs are kind of brushing up against one another, clashing and allowing the sparks to fly. Ichio stitches together scraps of dialogue as though overheard in a jostling crowd, sketches of characters in bustling motion, the competing sights and smells of the district, a flurry of broken images. Throngs packed the Otori shrine. The roar of young laughter is loud enough to rend the pillars holding up the heavens, to tear away the very cord from which the earth hangs. Today, the side drawbridges are down clear around the moat, and the crowds keep pouring in. Coming through, coming through. What have we here? Some flat-bottomed boat trying to navigate these waves of people. Peals of laughter, incessant chatter echo from the little shops around the ditch. Strains of the samisen rise from the first-class pleasure houses, towering several stories in the sky. Another particularly fascinating thing about the story is that it's published at a time when the Meiji writers at the sort of forefront of literary experimentation are very much being informed by the latest developments in European writing, in the literature of the Western urban metropolis. But Ichio turns to another source for her own inspiration, and one that's native to Japanese soil, in the writer Saikaku. Ichio's discovery of the 17th century poet and prose writer Ihara Saikaku seems to have been pivotal. The inspiration stemming from his work seems to have offered a certain freedom in Ichio's writing that was not entirely present before. Saikaku is strongly associated with the floating world genre, which, among many other things, is characterized by its focus on subjects that in classical literature would be considered inappropriate. It reflected a move away from the aristocratic refinement of more lofty works to focus on the lives of everyday townspeople. The famous ukiyo-e woodblock prints and paintings take their name from this genre, as they would often be included as illustrations. Danley describes Saikaku, and by turn Ichio, as being less concerned with the continuity of a steady focus on one subject, one hero, than they were in creating a shifting tableau. They swing from topic to topic by compressing narrative time, telescoping the point of view, so that a panoply of personages, scenes and events can all be presented in a way that amounts to trompe-l'oeil. Everything seems to happen at the same instant. The story isn't only a portrait of the Yoshiwara. I mean, it certainly is that, and the environment itself is as much of a character, or perhaps more so, arguably, as anyone else. But at the center of it is the figure of Midori, a beautiful, ebullient young girl, whose growth and maturation we observe as readers, while being quite painfully aware that her growth is also a kind of descent, and that she's very likely to follow in the footsteps of her sister and end up as a courtesan in one of the pleasure houses. And this is brought quite painfully to the fore by Ichio when she first describes Midori wearing her hair in the Shimada style. Attention is paid to Midori's hair earlier in the story when she pins it up in the red bear style, a marker of her maidenhood. But the transition from this to the Shimada style signifies her maturity and perhaps the impending loss of her innocence. Midori had difficulty speaking. "I had it done this morning at my sister's. I hate it." Her spirits drooped. She kept her head down. She couldn't bear it when a passerby would gawk. While Midori's fate seemed sealed, Ichio's own was cut short by tuberculosis. She would die at the young age of 24. During her last summer on Earth, she spent the day with some close friends. Danley writes, "They sat on the veranda, by the pond and the swaying leaves of the banana tree, and she consoled them. 'Don't worry, I'll be a butterfly in the next life, and I'll come back and tickle you on the sleeve.'" So I've thoroughly enjoyed my time with In the Shade of Spring Leaves, and I have to thank Quentin S. Crisp for this marvellous recommendation. I think it's a book that's enriched enormously by Dan Lee's scholarship and by the life that is paired with the work here. I only wish that there were more editions like this, that more sort of annotated editions that pair a biography with the writer's work. I think it's something that really enhances the reading experience. And yeah, this was a very rich one for me. I heartily recommend this book. So some really exciting things have arrived recently. I was thrilled to receive my copy of I Reign in Hell, which is a kind of retrospective of Quentin S. Crisp's career. This is published by Centipede Press, and yeah, it's a beautiful limited edition signed hardback with wonderful illustrations by Harry Brockway. I think as soon as I finish my little odyssey with Japanese women writers, I think I'm going to be turning to this one because, yeah, Quentin S. Crisp is one of my absolute favourite writers. If you've been watching me for any length of time, you'll know that. I've talked about him quite a lot on this channel, and I'm just, yeah, so happy to see him get this kind of treatment. So, yeah, very excited about that one. I'm also very excited to have received this new printing of Stupid Baby by New Juche. This is published by Amphetamine Sulfate. It's a slightly older text, but I think this is going to be the final printing, so I'm very pleased to add it to my collection. Frankly, I will read absolutely anything that New Juche puts out. He's one of my absolute favourites in terms of my recent discoveries, so yeah, excited to have a look at this one very soon as well. The summer showers keep me inside, but in these weeks of maddening heat, it can be a great pleasure to bask in the cool respite of a rainy day. So it's the 13th of July today. It's ever so slightly cooler out. That dreadful heat has abated somewhat, so I thought I'd come out and talk to you. For the past few days I've been immersed in Fumiko Enchi's Masks. This one is quite a short book. It's about 120 pages, but despite its slimness, but despite its short length, it's wonderfully powerful and resonant text, I thought. I'm also quite surprised that I haven't really been aware of Fumiko Enchi and her work up until now. She's clearly someone that's very highly regarded in Japanese literature. On the back cover, there's a quote from Yukio Mishima, who calls this book an esoteric masterpiece. Its story is quite knotted and convoluted, such that incidents that at first seem insignificant ramify in all sorts of unexpected directions, and the complex entanglement of its characters grows more and more labyrinthine as the book progresses. At its heart, however, is a love triangle. Two men in love with the same woman. The first, Ibuki, is a scholar of Japanese literature. The second, Mikame, is a doctor, but both share an academic interest in the topic of spirit possession, and both are in love with Yasuko, a beautiful and recently widowed young woman who's fallen under the sway of her deceased husband Akio's mother, the mysterious poetess and scholar Miyako, who, as the narrative progresses, appears to be manipulating their love triangle to suit her own devious ends. Her means of doing so appear at times supernatural. Finally, there is the figure of Harume, Akio's twin sister, born with developmental disabilities, and she too will play an unfortunate role in this puppet play that gradually unfolds under Miyako's grim direction. One particularly fascinating and exciting aspect of the book for me is that it reads very much like a ghost story, and curiously a ghost story without being a horror novel in any sense at all. It certainly doesn't fit within any traditional description of the horror genre, but it feels very much like a ghost story nonetheless. But the nature of its ghosts is harder to pinpoint. Is the ghost to be found in the figure of Akio, Yasuko's husband, who dies while climbing Mount Fuji, and whose memory haunts many of the novel's characters? Or is it to be found in the shamanistic practice of spirit possession, a subject that is a matter of academic inquiry for several of the novel's key figures? Or is it to be found in the spirit of Japanese Heian-era literature and Noh theatre that are so inescapable within its pages? References to Noh theatre and Heian-era prose, particularly Genji Monogatari, are threaded very liberally throughout this narrative. And it made me very conscious of the fact that I'm far less familiar with either of those things than I'd really like to be. And just how helpful it could be in understanding more contemporary Japanese literature. So it's something I'd really like to correct in the future. In any case, both of those things are embedded in the very fabric and structure of this book. The book's 3 sections are each named after Noh masks. Ryo no Onna, the spirit woman that represents a vengeful spirit tormented from beyond the grave by the resentments in her life. Masugami, the young woman in a state of frenzy. And Fukai, a mask usually used for middle-aged women. Its characters in Japanese can be written to mean either deep well or deep woman. In his article, Enchi Fumiko and the Hidden Energy of the Supernatural, Wayne Pounds argues that Noh is of central importance in the novel's metaphorical structure, for it best exemplifies that energy of unseen powers, as if something dead had come back to life, which defines the novel's supernaturalism. He draws on Carmen Blacker's research, noting that anthropologists find in the plays concealed shamanic rituals, which were in former times used to call up a ghost and cause it to speak. The highly deliberate interlacing of the novel's structure, events, and patterned illusions sets up an interplay between the contemporary and the historical. It's no coincidence that the novel should open with a séance. The book itself is consciously engaged in a kind of necromancy, a ritual summoning of Japanese cultural inheritance, allowing it to walk like a living spirit in symbols, archetypes, acts and objects. The No masks themselves are the most conspicuous example of this. There's a scene early on in the narrative in which four of the main characters, Ibuki, Mikame, Yasuko and Mieko, are invited to the home of a No theatre practitioner and scholar in order to examine his collection of ancient costumes and masks. It's a very beautiful and extremely unsettling scene, I thought. Yorikata picked up the mask and slowly extended his arms up and out, holding it level with his own face. It was the visage of a coldly beautiful woman, her cheeks tightly drawn. The sweep of the eyelids was long, and the red of the upper lip extended out to the corners of the mouth in an uneven and involved line, curving at last into a smile of disdain. A haughty cruelty was frozen hard upon the face, encasing it like crystals of ice on a tree. For me, it's a scene that announces so many of the book's major themes. The idea of the pressing weight of history and memory upon the present, the forcing of women into archetypal roles, but also this sense of how much is hidden in human interaction and how little we can actually truly know about any other person. In terms of the book's profound relationship with Genji Monogatari, Enchi seems to take inspiration primarily from a character that's regarded by many as a minor figure in the tale of Genji, the Rakujo lady, one of Genji's slighted lovers. And this figure becomes more and more closely aligned with Mieko in Enchi's novel. And she seems to be a figure that forces us to acknowledge the blurring of the boundaries between the malign and the maligned. After engaging in an affair with Genji, the Rakujo lady is shunned, pushed aside in favor of Lady Aoi, who eventually bears Genji's child. Seething with jealousy, her spirit emerges in malevolent form to cling to Lady Aoi, who sickens and eventually dies as a result. Are we to regard the Rakujo lady as a figure greedy for vengeance, or as one who reacts unwittingly to a tragic situation? She also re-emerges as a figure in the No play Nonomiya, or The Shrine in the Fields, set in a location that will also play a role in this novel. It's unsurprising that Fumiko Enchi's masks should be so elusive, that she should write a novel whose roots spread deep into the soil of Heian-era literature. Part of Enchi's literary career was taken up by the translation of the tale of Genji into modern Japanese. She set many of her books in the Heian period, and a number of them, including Masks, are directly influenced by this work. Another really clever and subtle aspect of the book is the way in which it plays with the presentation of its female characters. Enchi seems to have made the decision very overtly to tell the story largely through the perspective of its male characters, and when we take on that lens, there's no choice but to view the figure of Mieko as this master manipulator, this cruel-hearted lady out for vengeance and willing to destroy the lives of others in order to get it. But there are subtler ways in which that view of Mieko can be utterly undermined, I think. On the surface, Miyako's influence is undeniably malign. Ibuki and Yasuko discuss the feeling of being manipulated like marionettes, drawn together into their affair under the force of her mysterious power. Her most heinous deed, the use of the disabled girl Harume in a bizarre trance-induced sexual act in order to have her impregnated, is almost unutterably horrid. And yet, like the Rokujo lady, Miyako is a woman slighted by the world. Her husband is a pig. She suffers a miscarriage after being injured by his lover, is forced to conceal the identity of her son's real father. She is one whom the world has tortured. When Miyako writes of her sympathy for the Rokujo lady, how she turned unconsciously to spirit possession as the only available outlet for her strong will, it strikes me that she may also be speaking of herself. But this is a book of unknown motivations, a book in which all characters are masked, one in which, towards its close, two very close friends, Ibuki and Mikame, can sit opposite one another and fall into a solemn silence, eye to eye. Neither could make out any reflection in the eyes of the other, and there was a bleak weariness in the dull realization that they would see nothing, however long they might wait. So I'm absolutely thrilled to have encountered Fumiko Enshi's work, even if she is already quite a well-known writer. My first encounter with her has been really quite invigorating. I can only wholeheartedly recommend Masks. It's an extraordinary crystalline little book of enormous depth, I think, despite its brevity. I even picked up another of her books, The Waiting Years, which I hope to read quite soon. And she's also really inspired me to try and get to grips with Genji Monogatari at some point in the future. I've had my copy sitting on the shelf for a few years now, so it's about time I dusted it off and had a proper look. In a few days' time, I'm going to be heading on a little trip to Mazury, to the Lake District in Poland, and I'm going to be taking a few books with me. So we'll catch up again then, and I'll let you know what I find myself reading. I leave Warsaw and take the 3.5-hour trip to Skowronę, southeast of Elbląg. Once there, I'm met with a silence you can scarcely find in the capital. Unknown shades of green. So it's the 16th of July today. It's a few days since we last spoke. Quite an eventful few days, I suppose. England lost to Spain in the European Championship. There was that assassination attempt on Donald Trump. Yeah, quite eventful. Less so in my own life. I'm here in a place called Krakotki, a wonderfully quiet little spot in Warmińsko-Mazurskie Województwo. I was expecting to be staying next to a big lake, but instead it's a series of still ponds and a slow river. There's a lot of lily pads across the surface of these ponds. I've spotted quite a number of frogs. The ground is quite wet and marshy, so there's lots of dragonflies and butterflies fluttering about. It's really quite beautiful. So the little spot where I'm sitting right now is quite incongruous amidst all this sort of proliferation of plant and insect life. It's a little wooden Chinese-style gazebo painted a very cute red and yellow. So it feels quite out of place, but it's wonderfully quiet and very relaxing here. In any case, I thought I'd let you know what I brought with me. So I've just started reading Toddler Hunting and Other Stories by Taeko Konno. These are stories published throughout the 1960s, so it's a smaller leap chronologically from the last book to this one. I first heard about Taeko Kono from an interview with Kenzaburo Oe. He mentioned her as one of the contemporary writers by whom he'd been most impressed. So I needed no more encouragement than that. I went out to get it straight away, but I'm only now just getting to grips with it, getting around to reading it. The introduction is by Sakaya Murata, the writer of this very popular book, The Convenience Store Woman, and quite oddly to my mind, the introduction makes this sound like a series of grotesque horror tales. So far anyway, it doesn't feel like that to me at all. Granted, I've only read a few of the stories, but they seem much more like stories of quiet epiphany to me. They're quite subtle in their construction, and instead of any sense of horror or the grotesque, there's a kind of humming, gradually building this sense of disquiet. From what I've heard about the title story, Toddler Hunting, and you can probably tell from that name, I am expecting something perhaps a little bit more transgressive. But in the opening two stories, Night Journey and Full Tide, the sense of disquiet seems to be something that emerges from this sort of muted reconfiguration of traditional relationships. These fissures that begin to run through traditional ideas about marriage or about the family unit. The two opening stories challenge conservative values, perhaps, in exposing attachments that lie outside the confines of the marriage. Their focus is on the interstices, the unlit spots that proliferate within conventional relationships, illicit bonds whose depths must remain hidden. I also really appreciate the fact that these stories, so far at least, don't seem to adhere to any of the structural conventions of the traditional short story form. They don't feel like these tightly wound pieces that spring up into some violent climax or overwhelming revelation. Instead, there is a sense that meaning is not something that will be stated, but something ambient, a cumulative, emergent property of the tales we encounter. I take a walk along the path by the river. In this verdant region, even the sunlight coming through the trees takes on a kind of emerald effulgence. I plan to read, but for now the water and the breeze give me everything I need. I think it can wait until tomorrow. So I've just read the title story, Toddler Hunting, and I think I have to take back my earlier claim about these stories not building to a kind of violent climax, as this one certainly does. At the centre of it is a sort of dream vision that's highly transgressive and contains some very depraved imagery. Akiko, the story's heroine, harbours the most heinous desires one can imagine. For the most part, she manages to contain them, giving them indirect expression, pressing up against the borders of acceptable conduct. But internally, in those spaces of the mind that no one can enter, they surge upward and take flight.
As the dream world spread out about her, Akiko would plunge herself into it, her pulse beating faster and faster, and her skin all moist, and she would reach ecstasy, losing all self-control.
The vision we encounter is perhaps too grim to give in full, but it moves quickly. A young boy is beaten by a father, the lash of the cane, the streaming of blood, the flaying of flesh in the blazing summer sun, the purple rope of the intestines. For all its depravity and willingness to engage with certain taboos, the story is still quite subtle in its construction, I would argue. Our protagonist, Akiko, we're given to understand, experiences an overpowering sense of arousal at the very idea of enacting violence upon young boys. But this is never suggested through any direct action of her own. It's always suggested via juxtaposition or mediation, perhaps. I'm thinking of scenes like the acts of sadomasochism between Akiko and Saseki, and also the wonderfully exuberant but simultaneously melancholic scene towards the end of the story involving the young boy eating his piece of watermelon.
Using both hands, the child brought the watermelon to his mouth, and with each bite, juice gushed over his small, soft-looking upper lip. While he worked on swallowing a mouthful, he would pull the chunk of fruit down with a sharp jerk and hold it in front of him. 2 bright red streaks were pointing up like flames from either side of his mouth.
The composition of that final scene is really extraordinary, as we have a very palpable sense of the two figures, Akiko and this little boy, having quite vastly differing emotional responses to this interaction, whose edges only just touch. And when it's over, it's unclear whether we're left with a sense of emptiness or fulfillment, and perhaps it's both at the same time.
"You have it," he said. "I don't want it anymore." He probably no longer wanted to eat it now that somebody else's mouth had touched it. He ran off, wiping his fingers on the seat of his trousers. A little way down the street, he stopped, turned, and looked back at Akiko, who stood rooted to the spot, not knowing what to do with the unexpected gift in her hands.
I can see why this story was chosen as the title piece for this collection. So far it's the one that's had the biggest impact on me, and has left me quite shaken, actually. So I'm really excited now to continue reading Taeko Kono's stories. So I've been continuing with Taeko Kono's toddler hunting and other stories. And I have to say, it does seem to be the case that the collection is growing more and more harrowing as it goes on. I really appreciate the way that Kono will present these very recognizable, usually familial situations or very recognizable desires, but distort them in such a way that they appear to us disfigured or dislocated versions of that thing we know. And I think that allows the darker edges that exist in those things for all of us to stand out in quite stark relief. I think what I'm talking about is encapsulated quite perfectly in an image from a story called Snow. The story itself is a sort of variation on the idea of the changeling. Our protagonist Hayako grows up without realizing at first that she has replaced another child named Hayako who perished in quite heinous circumstances. I won't reveal everything. But this image relates to the blood, or the kind of blood that Hayako shares with her mother.
There was no doubt that her brother was her mother's child, but time and again, Hayako had the impression that she too shared her mother's blood. Not the thick, rich blood that flows peacefully through the veins, but the blood they sucked and licked from the scratches inflicted on each other when they fought tooth and nail. So passionate was their attachment.
One thing I find particularly fascinating about these stories is their presentation of women. Every story so far has had a female protagonist, but the stories all seem in various covert and overt ways to be geared towards the dismantling of archetypes of femininity, or in some cases the very intentional brutalizing of those archetypes. So Kono will set in her sights the figure of the devoted mother or the loving wife or the dutiful daughter, and then proceed to darken or explode those figures entirely. Yeah, it does seem quite subversive, I think. In her study, The Other Women's Lib, Gender and Body in Japanese Women's Fiction, Julia C. Bullock notes that during the 1960s, Japanese society was experiencing a resurgence of the pre-war good wives and wise mothers ideology, encouraging women to meet these stereotypical expectations. She sees in Kono's radical depictions of women who fail to adhere to this mold, the many instances of unmarried, promiscuous, infertile, or even infanticidal women, not only as a conscious expression of resistance, but also as an echo of Kono's own decisions not to follow the path prescribed by society. Kono herself did not marry until the age of 39 and never had children. Her career thus resembled anything but the image of traditional housewife and mother. Perhaps for this reason, she consistently crafts protagonists who resist conventionally feminine roles. I feel I've scarcely been in such a fertile landscape. There's an almost unnerving proliferation of life here. Just today I was walking by the riverbank, and with every step I took, what seemed like a dozen frogs would sort of leap out of the wet grass and into the river. It's just so many shades of green. It feels almost primordial, this moist heat, these wells of viscid germination quickening underfoot, the water thick with frog spawn, this surfeit of vitality. It's curious too to read in these surroundings the story Ants Swarm, whose protagonist Fumiko begins as vehemently opposed to motherhood, but changes her mind when the most anti-maternal instincts swell within her, acts of violence towards her imaginary daughter. It seems fitting too that the story should end with an image in which the proliferation of life, its teeming, jostling exuberance, meets disgust at its swarming overabundance. A putrefying piece of meat left aside is devoured by an army of ants.
Fumiko concentrated on observing the movements of the ants individually, each one burrowing away, its body trembling while it pushed its head eagerly into the meat. After a while, however, her eyes grew tired, and she had to give up trying to focus on them singly. There were just too many, and all so close together. As she gazed, they formed a single writhing mass again before her eyes, a black lump squirming obscenely, teasing and goading her on.
So unfortunately I'm going to be leaving this place tomorrow. It's been quite a short stay, so it really feels like a shame. It's just so beautiful here. But in any case, I'm going to be returning to Warsaw, so I'll probably finish Taeko Kono's book quite soon, and I'll let you know how I get on once I'm back at home. leaving this landscape of spawning, swarming life for the paved sterility of the capital can feel like a sudden desaturation of colour. But I'm always glad to reach Warsaw. This place, to which I remain a foreigner, has felt like home for a long time now. So I'm back in Warsaw now. I've been back for about a week, and I finally got a bit of a chance to talk to you. I'm down here by the Praga banks of the Wisła. I really love coming here, especially on weekdays. It's really quiet, hardly anyone's around. So I've now finished Taeko Kono's Toddler Hunting and Other Stories, and I have to say I've been really quite impressed by it. There are a few stories in here perhaps that didn't summon much of a response in me, but those that did really made an impact. And she seems to me quite a unique writer, especially among writers that are labelled transgressive, because it seems that her reasons for including such elements, things like lurid details of sexual perversity or strange fetishes and fixations and violence, things like this, are quite different from those of other writers. There's no sense of a longing to shock the reader simply. Rather, it seems that Kono wants to sort of demonstrate the coexistence of mundanity and the transgressive, this coexistence of ordinary lives and these sometimes self-destructive or even criminal forms of desire. Lucy North, the translator of these stories, puts this well in her afterword when she states that these proclivities are sewn into the underside of her protagonist's everyday life in a way that requires us to consider their logic. North goes on to note that many of the stories foreground the insecurity and invisibility of women who are single or who would prefer not to have children in a society that was pervaded by an ideology of motherhood. The logic, perhaps, that emerges is a kind of literalized metaphor. The conservatism surrounding the expectations of women renders any deviation from this norm a form of transgression by default. There are a few particularly remarkable stories in this collection. I would highlight Full Tide, Toddler Hunting, Snow, and Ants Swarm. But there's another that I think is also very interesting, and it's the one for which Kono won the Akutagawa Prize in 1963. It's called Crabs, and it's one of the most sort of enigmatic and mystifying stories in here. Again, it features at its center a married couple. Yuko is afflicted with tuberculosis. Her husband, Kaji, forbids her to have surgery that will potentially save her life, for the puerile reason that it will leave her with a scar across her back. After much difficulty, she eventually persuades him to let her take a period of rest cure at the seaside. We sense as readers that for Yuko, this restorative journey is necessary both physically and emotionally. There are two elements of the story that I find especially enigmatic. The first is Yuko, the protagonist's relationship with the young boy Takeshi, which seems to swing between very tender and then almost obsessive. And it's unclear to me what it might represent. At times it feels like it represents a kind of escape from the matrix of violence and disregard in which she's embedded through marriage. But then it also seems at times that there's something a little bit more sinister at play. Perhaps it's the influence of Kono's preoccupations imbuing the innocent with a sinister colouring, but the scene involving Yuko scratching the boy Takeshi before bed without ever stating anything directly, skirts the borders of something implicitly sexual. And the second, somewhat related element is this increasingly obsessive pursuit of the crabs for the young boy to play with. It seems that at a certain point, Yuko submits entirely to the young boy's desires and seems somewhat inordinately eager to please him. The pursuit of the crabs seems to symbolize a kind of recovery. In chasing something elusive, Yuko projects her will beyond necessity, outward into the realms of frivolity and childish delight, and yet a shadow of submission still hangs over her, both in the turning over of that will to her nephew's desire and in her need to keep this frivolity secret from her husband. Sometimes it's the stories about which one has the least clearly formed critical viewpoint, or about which one can be the least articulate, that is the most powerful. And it certainly seems to be the case for me with crabs. It's one that I want to go back to and try and read about and see what others have said about it. But yeah, it's a very interesting one, I think. So yeah, I really hope we get more translations of Tayako Kono's work in the future. I'd be very interested to see how her preoccupations and style might look at novel length, for instance. And I know she's written a number of novels. I recommend it very much. I think her strange, uncategorizable stories are extraordinarily compelling. Let me know what you think if you've read this one. There's another book that I've read since I got back, that I wanted to talk to you about, but I'm running out of time today, so I have to catch you later, perhaps at home, and talk to you about it then. A few more really interesting things to arrive recently. I picked up a copy of Deliver Me by Elle Nash. This is a writer I discovered a few years ago when I read her book Animals Eat Each Other, and I was utterly enraptured by it. I've been waiting eagerly for the publication of this one, so I'm excited to finally have it in my hands. She's such a wonderful stylist, and I'm told this book has elements of body horror, so I'm very interested to see what she will do in something closer to the horror genre. So yeah, very excited to try this one. So I also picked up World Within Walls. This is one volume of Donald Keen's hugely ambitious, epic, multi-volume history of Japanese literature. This one covers what Keen refers to as the pre-modern era, so from 1600 to 1867, just before the Meiji Restoration. I believe that period is more generally referred to as the Edo period. I hope I'm not incorrect about that. And I picked it up because eventually I'd like to have all the volumes of this history so that I can consult them at will. But also, I found a huge respect for Donald Keen after I read his translation of Mishima's After the Banquet. And I found that even though that particular novel didn't stand out as one of my favourites, it really did stand out for its for the elegance of its English. It struck me as one of the most beautifully translated of Mishima's books that I've ever read. So yeah, I naturally wanted to explore more of Keen's work. So over the last week I also read Terminal Boredom. This is a collection of stories, science fiction short stories by Izumi Suzuki. It's put out by Verso Books, And I found that quite curious because, to my knowledge, they haven't published a great deal of fiction. They're far better known for philosophy and critical theory and politics books. So I was quite curious to see what they might find in this writer to make them want to publish her. The stories seem to range from around the 1960s to the 1980s. At least those are the years in which Suzuki was active. The edition doesn't do a great job of letting you know the publication history of the stories in Japan, but there are certain little cues and signals that give you an indication of when these stories were written. I suppose I was most drawn to this book because of Suzuki herself. She certainly seems like an absolutely fascinating figure. If Taeko Kono is a writer that depicted women who defied models of traditional female behavior, then Izumi Suzuki is someone who embodied a kind of transgressive femininity. In her short life, she worked as a hostess. She starred in so-called pink films, a form of erotic cinema. She worked as an actor, becoming a member of the underground theatre collective Tenjo Sajiki, whose work was frequently highly confrontational, experimental and grotesque. She posed nude for photographs, a posthumous collection of which was titled Izumi, This Bad Girl. And this bad girl image is something that forms a certain halo around her life and work. Her tumultuous, abusive relationship with the free jazz saxophonist Kaoru Abe is well documented and inspired the novel and movie adaptation Endless Waltz. She's clearly someone who lived as an outsider, who rejected convention in both art and life. Given the more sensational and sensationalized aspects of her life, it would be easy for the work itself to be overshadowed, but in some ways, the writing is just as uncompromising. So although all of these stories could certainly be categorized as science fiction, the degree to which those science fictional elements are foregrounded in each story varies enormously, I would say. There are some in which the sort of fantastical component appears to be the main current or the point of the story, but there are others in which those elements form a kind of backdrop to an exploration of something else, so either a thematic concern or interpersonal relationships or the emotional journey of a character. But almost every single one of them contains some very interesting central idea, and it's usually something quite novel. Among the striking ideas here are drugs that alter the rate at which time passes, a medical procedure that allows one to enter another's dreams, or, in the opening story, Women and Women, an imagined matriarchal society in which men are consigned to locked institutions and erased from the public consciousness. In this story, the narrator's life gains unexpected degrees of complexity when she spies an escaped boy under her window at night. Their relationship opens up areas of experience that have been entirely unknown to her.
I spent the rest of that day learning the unexpected, dreadful truth about human life. Learning it with my body.
Suzuki's status as a kind of countercultural icon is certainly something that sort of bleeds into the content of these stories. They're laced with references to pop music and rock music, and even some avant-garde jazz. For instance, Sunrise name-dropped in one of the stories. But it's also apparent in the sort of progressive and hedonistic tendencies of some of her characters. There are instances of same-sex relationships. There are quite casual attitudes to sex. There's even a kind of interracial human-alien relationship here. There's lots of drug use and alcohol use. This certainly seems to be full of things that would be very much against the grain in her contemporary Japan. My favourite thing about these stories is definitely this sense of a kind of melancholic malaise that hangs over so many of them. This sense of disaffection or disconnection that's shared by so many of her characters. And there are two stories in particular that do something very interesting with that quality. The first is Night Picnic, which seems to kind of engage with that feeling on a very metaphorical level. Night Picnic is set in an abandoned cityscape. Its curious conceit is that it involves a group of beings, we are initially uncertain what they might be, who dwell in this empty urban metropolis, playing at the role of being earthlings, forcing themselves to perform as members of a traditional family. The father figure spends his mornings reading newspapers stitched together from old copies. There are disputes over how a teenager should react during an argument, etc. The power of the story lies in its exposure of the essential performativity of human behavior, forms of behavior that are so routine as to acquire the illusion of being innate. The story applies pressure to that painful, unexamined, protective callus of our being that, were it to be lanced, might very well expose an emptiness we're too frightened to acknowledge. And this feeling is explored in quite a prescient manner by the title story, Terminal Boredom, which examines this condition of only being able to feel something, only being able to respond to the world when reality is mediated in some form. It seems to be a response to this kind of exponential proliferation of media with which we're still struggling today on a sort of greater scale than even Suzuki could have imagined. And yet, at least in conception, the story shares some similarities with certain ideas about entertainment explored 30 years later in Infinite Jest. Suzuki imagines a kind of hedonistic mediation as the primary interaction with reality. A surgical procedure allows total submission to the spectacle.
What happens when you get it? All the shitty stuff stops bothering you. Like, you realize that there's a simple way of dealing with everything that's been weighing on you up till now. You can just tack on an illogical ending to the story, like a deus ex machina for life. Reality feels like a TV show, and TV shows feel like reality. It's like the boundary between them breaks down, like you're living in a dream.
So I did enjoy Terminal Boredom. There are lots of things that I found fascinating about it, but if I'm perfectly honest, I wanted to enjoy it quite a bit more than I in fact did. I was very excited to explore the work of this young, rebellious punk pioneer of science fiction in 1960s Japan. But many of these stories lean very heavily on quite uninteresting dialogue, these kind of rather flat exchanges that seem to go on. And however interesting the kind of core idea in the backdrop of these stories might be, the sort of moment-to-moment quality of the writing and the style of these stories wasn't quite enough to carry them for me. I also didn't get a very strong sense of Suzuki's style as a writer. There are certainly preoccupations here and a certain turn of mind that's apprehensible, but on the level of purely on the level of her writing or the voice, I didn't really feel that there was anything particularly notable here. I wonder if it's anything to do with the fact that there were so many different translators involved in this edition. I think each story is translated by a different person. There are also some quite strangely mixed registers in here. There are Americanisms alongside British slang that struck me as quite jarring. So I will give her other collection, Hit Parade of Tears, a try, but perhaps not for a little while. In any case, I'm going to be reading my final book of this reading diary very soon, so I hope I enjoy it quite a bit more than I did this one. So I have a little errand to run in Powieśla, but while I'm there I thought I'd show you something interesting. Let's go and have a look. On my way to Powieśla, I cut through Marienstadt, one of my favourite parts of Warsaw. Whatever time of day it is, there's always an eerie quiet here. Despite its beauty, it seems singularly unpopular. The square is a field of blazing heat. The pastel facades peel slowly under a white sun. I always make sure to pass the so-called przekupka, vendor or market wife statue, soaking up some of the silence she embodies. This is the Poniatowski Viaduct in Powieśla. It was heavily damaged in both world wars, has undergone extensive reconstruction over the course of its 120-year history. I find its echoing emptiness quite compelling, a lowering lacuna in the centre of the city. So it's almost the end of July now. I've been on this little journey with Japanese women writers for about a month. So if you've made it this far, thanks so much, and I applaud your patience. So the final book I'm reading is Mieko Kawakami's Breasts and Eggs. This is one that caused a bit of a sensation a few years ago when it was published. I got it not long after then, but it's been sitting around patiently on my shelves waiting for me to pick it up. I thought this would be a nice opportunity. So far I'm about 2/3 of the way through the book, and I found quite a lot to admire about it. It has a certain understated, quiet beauty, and it feels also very controlled. Kawakami, for the most part, narrates in quite a sparse, straightforward narrative style, but she seems to know how to withhold her firepower, as it were, and at moments of greater emotional intensity, the writing will sort of explode into hitherto unexplored regions of linguistic density, and when it does, it's quite powerful. The book is split into two sections. The two sections center around the 30-year-old writer Natsuko. In the first section, she is visited by her older sister Makiko and her niece Midoriko. Makiko is flamboyant, reckless. She has come to Tokyo in order to have a breast enlargement, a fact that embarrasses her pubescent daughter Midoriko, who is deeply troubled and angry, and when we meet her is undergoing a period of voluntary muteness. The second section revisits these characters after a period of 10 years. In the first section, there's a really interesting alignment between the three main characters, beyond their blood relationship, of course. And that's that they all seem to find themselves in a sort of state of in-betweenness, in this kind of liminal, transitional moment in their lives, and are forced to undergo some kind of reckoning to transform. Makiko's transformation is decidedly physical. She works as a hostess in Osaka, and her decision to have breast implants occupies her every waking moment. She forces Natsuko to peruse the many catalogues of cosmetic surgeons, which she seems to know by heart, cover to cover. At the public baths, she stares unabashedly at the breasts of other bathers. She consults her sister on the colour of her nipples, lamenting their darkness.
I mean, what the hell are these? A couple of Oreos? Not even. More like black cherries. They're the color of a flat screen after you turn it off. The other day I was shopping and I saw one and I was like, shit, I know that color. Where have I seen that before? Oh, right, my nipples.
It's as though she has distilled every aspect of her identity, her future and her worth, locating its quintessence in the body and its transformation. For Natsuko, the transition is both economic and intellectual. The locus of her own worth is the degree to which she has made her way out of the poverty in which she grew up, and in her identity as a writer. She's continually preoccupied with a certain stasis in her productivity as an artist.
What I do know, as much as it hurts to admit, is that 10 years after leaving behind Makiko and Midoriko, and coming to Tokyo to become a writer, I have nothing to show them, and have no way of making their lives easier. It made me feel small and useless.
Most interesting for me is the teenager Midoriko, who of course is undergoing a kind of inescapable transition in the form of puberty, and her subjective experience of that as something disruptive is perhaps echoed in the way that she appears on the page. So her journal entries disrupt the core narrative with thoughts that are unrelated or that clash with the central story. But what at first appears to clash often complements thematically. Midoriko, in some senses, could be said to stand at the crossroads between Natsuko and Makiko. She's a character who is most at ease when expressing herself in writing. She has largely shunned interaction in favor of introspection, perhaps in response to the intrusive essentialism of the body, which is making itself more and more undeniable.
It feels like I'm trapped inside my body. It decides when I get hungry and when I'll get my period. From birth to death, you have to keep eating and making money just to stay alive.
The title, Breasts and Eggs, in its reference to menstruation, sustenance, and maternal nurturing, when placed against the predicaments of these three women, foregrounds the body as a site of productivity as well as reproductivity. The matrix of the body, economic autonomy, the expression of self, these must be navigated at all three stages of womanhood, represented by the characters. Kawakami does a wonderful job, I think, of gradually exposing the sort of tenderness that lies several levels deeper than the awkward, stilted, or sometimes even hostile interactions between them. There's an extraordinary scene when our narrator takes Midoriko on a Ferris wheel. Natsuko recalls an act of Makiko's tremendous kindness. As a young girl, Natsuko had been unable to join her classmates on a grape-picking trip. Using rolled-up underwear and socks, Makiko transformed their kitchen into an ersatz vineyard for her baby sister, recreating the trip she had missed. This memory seems to set the night aglow as she recounts it for Midoriko on the whirling Ferris wheel.
The sky reached into the past and into obscurity, streaked with strips of cloud-like marks left by a tired finger. The light leaking between the clouds was touched with purples, gentle reds, and heavy blues. It almost felt as if we could touch this layer wrapped around the world, if we just stuck out our hands. It showed its colors like a melody that could never be repeated. Hey, it's kind of like we're inside a giant grape.
So far I've been significantly less captivated by the second, much longer section of the book, despite the fact that it does deal with some really interesting subject matter. For instance, Natsuko's realization that she may be asexual, and the way in which this clashes quite severely with her growing desire to have a child, despite not wanting a partner of any kind, seemingly. But my problem with it is rather that, once again, it tends towards dialogue. It's very dialogue heavy, and there are these long, quite uninteresting conversations with characters that, to my mind, feel like ciphers or just representative of one particular idea, without any desires or identity, and that's something that I'm not really interested in reading most of the time. But I'd still say that what I admire about it certainly outweighs the problems I have with it, so I haven't given up just yet. So I'll read on to the end, and hopefully we'll catch up very soon, and I'll let you know how it went. So I've come to a little place called Topolina, where a very close friend has a beautiful jauka with a gorgeous garden, and she grows her own vegetables. It's a really wonderful place. I love coming here, so I'm just going to be staying the night. My friend grows cucumbers and tomatoes under the watchful eyes of the poplar trees that stand guard, and which give Topolina its name. The Polish word is topola. I love this place for its little sanctuaries, its pockets of green and shadow, its bright flowers that colour the tranquility like the final brushstrokes on a canvas. So I finished reading Mieko Kawakami's Breasts and Eggs, and although there was a period in the middle where my attention and interest had started to flag a little bit, by the end I found myself really absorbed in it once more, especially at the point at which Natsuko returns to Osaka. There's a wonderful feeling that's evoked there that is really familiar to me as someone who's left their hometown and doesn't get to go back very often. This very relatable feeling of being both anchored to this place but simultaneously adrift. The uncanny feeling of the alien and the familiar, the changes that take place inside during one's absence from a place suddenly confront those that have occurred in the world, that awkward tessellation when everything is slightly askew is beautifully drawn. I was also really interested to see the return of the Ferris wheel, a different Ferris wheel this time in Osaka, and that echoing of the first section seemed to lend the image of the Ferris wheel a certain symbolic weight. The wheel comes to symbolize those cycles of movement and stasis, the upward drift towards a vantage point one knows, but seen differently on each revolution. The current carries some things, sweeps others away. So much of the second section seems to rest upon Natsuko being forced to absorb the opinions of other characters, the many opinions about what she should do with her body or what she should do with her career. So it's quite gratifying for the novel to end on a sort of triumphant note, with Natsuko having managed to circumvent the conventional notion of what a family is, or to sort of subvert the expectations of what motherhood might look like. It's particularly interesting to view this novel in comparison with Taeko Kono's stories from the 1960s. In Kono's work, for characters to reject motherhood entirely was the radical act. For Kawakami's narrator, the radical act is located elsewhere, in her embrace of motherhood as an autonomous act, rather than at the mercy of patriarchal standards and conventions. Very interestingly, in her article Embodiment and Its Violence in Kawakami Miyako's Chichitoran, Juliana Alzate notes the influence of Higuchi Ichio's Child's Play on Kawakami's novel. I'll leave a link below for anyone interested in the details, but the interplay between the two texts is quite expansive, extending far beyond the notable concern with the ways in which women's bodies are subject to patriarchal economic and social systems. One remembers the implications around Midori's likely fate as a courtesan in Child's Play. Among other things, Alzate mentions the echoes between Omaki and Makiko, the courtesan and the hostess, the fact that Kawakami names her narrator Natsuko, which is Ichio's given name, and a number of other intertextual links that occur on a linguistic level. It makes for very interesting reading. So I did find the novel quite fascinating ultimately, and particularly in the first section, there are lots of moments that are really memorable and actually quite moving. So I can definitely recommend the book on the grounds of its emotional impact. But perhaps I found less of interest in stylistic terms or in terms of its literary merit, but perhaps that's down to the translation of it. I wonder, for instance, how much of a role the Kansai dialect played in it. There's quite a lot of discussion of the peculiarities of the way people speak in Osaka, so I wonder how much of a role that played in the original Japanese. It's always tricky to be critical about matters of voice and style when dealing with a text in translation, but in this book the moments of linguistic beauty were ever so slightly too scarce to satisfy my personal taste fully. In the end, it's a book whose beauty lies elsewhere, in its tenderness, its triumphant rejection of convention, and in the longevity of deep sentiment between its characters. So I think I'm going to end my little reading diary there. I hope you've enjoyed this little journey with me, and if you did, please consider subscribing to the channel. It really means a lot to me when you do that, or when you share it somewhere online or with a bookish friend. Thanks ever so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.